Is thanking Cool Institute and Dr. Rockwell and Claire for getting this organized and inviting me to come and speak today. So my name is David Mcleod. I am a web developer at the Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia Library. Today I'm going to be talking about a project we've been working on really for quite a while now called Neatline. That goes back in sort of some form or another really about sort of 3 or 4 years now. It's sort of an ongoing project here at the lab. So to start with, though, I just thought I'd kind of begin with a general overview of what the Scholars Lab is, kind of what we do and where we are. So the Scholars Lab is a digital humanities central library at the University of Virginia. We were formed in 2006 by sort of combining 3 separate groups in the library, a sort of TEI encoding shop, a GIS group, and a kind of research computing support group that sort of helps with, kind of installing software and stuff like that. And so the current version of the Scholars Lab is kind of we have sort of a broad profile. We have kind of a public services group that manages a public-facing kind of high-performance computing lab in the library. And sort of going alongside with that and kind of working in collaboration with that group, we have a research and development sort of software engineering group that works on a pretty wide range of kind of digital humanities projects. We do faculty collaborations, we work with graduate students on sort of fellowship projects, and also pursue kind of independent, both grant-funded and kind of internally supported sort of R&D projects in the humanities. And so one aspect of the Scholars Lab that we sort of that we work on a lot is employees get a sort of 20% time to text. And that Neatline where to so I wanted to think sort of a introduction of kind of where Neatline emerged from kind of question trying to solve. Turn back off the audio. Thanks. Yeah. Sorry, Claire. I'm getting strong feedback. Well, so anyway, so kind of start by talking about where Neatline came from to address, and then move on to actually kind of showing the software, and then demoing some of the new sort of features and kind of workflows we put into the new 2.0 release that's just come out. So Neatline originally began back in 2008 as really kind of sort of coming off a project that the group had just completed. So the R&D group had just finished building a new kind of geospatial discovery portal for the library. So basically the kind of collection search interface that a user would go to if she were interested in any of the geospatial holdings in the library. It could be kind of a vector data sets, raster data, kind of, historical maps, basically any kind of holding in the library that has a direct, sort of geospatial coverage associated with it. So the group had just finished, building this new kind of interface where you could go and, kind of search for terms or kind of drag out a bounding box on the map to kind of define a sort of, region of the map that, they sort of want to for a library page for a student to kind of come and find these materials to discover a historic map or any kind of sort of spatial content. What's the sort of next step you take after you find those things? So kind of thinking about the sort of scholarly and intellectual workflows that come after that step of discovering the kind of raw kind of library holding. What's the next thing you do with that content? And so the insight and the idea originally was that, with a text, with a book, there are well-established, sort of modes of work you do once you've found those things. With these geospatial materials, though, it's less clear what you do. Screenshot, or just kind of describe in a monograph or an article. So we were interested in exploring ways of really kind of taking these materials and sort of staging them in a very kind of high fidelity, kind of interactive way that would really situate them in sort of a first class kind of geospatial environment instead of just sort of taking them and kind of baking off sort of a hard, kind of a hard version of an image or something like that. So it began originally, a developer here in the lab named Adam Soroka was experimenting with a prototype and kind of, built out a simple version of this that actually began by mapping a collection of sort of mapping out stories of H.P. Lovecraft, who, sort of wrote in great sort of his stories were connected to the kind of urban geography of Providence, Rhode Island. So taking these stories and sort of, mapping them out in Providence and kind of exploring how these things sort of, related to the city. And then that sort of prototype was supported in 2009 by an NEH Digital Humanities Startup Grant. And during that phase, a more robust prototype was built out. At that point, it was sort of a kind of a job on sort of performance and kind of really sort of maintaining very high quality metadata standards. And then in 2010, the sort of project shifted gears a bit. During the first stage of development, the original team kind of realized that in a lot of ways, in the process of sort of building the infrastructure to make this kind of work possible, they were actually kind of duplicating a lot of existing kind of functionality and capacity that existed elsewhere. The whole kind of web publication platform, just the sort of the foundation on which the materials are kind of published online, the basic sort of content management system, the way of kind of, adding and kind of interacting with the metadata. The sort of development team realized that really those tasks were kind of the sort of core things that they were trying to build on top of. So in a lot of ways, it would make more sense to sort of build Neatline instead of being kind of an independent, standalone, separate tool, as really being kind of part of a larger ecosystem, and kind of build it on top of some other platform that already kind of satisfied those requirements. And so at the time, the sort of team realized, and this was before I joined the group in 2011, that really this piece of software called Omeka in a lot of ways was for this is I would say it's like WordPress or Drupal, but kind of aimed at scholars, archivists, students, journalists, really any kind of work where you need to work with really kind of maintain high quality metadata and kind of build a collection of content that's really kind of designed to be durable and sort of well designed and well organized. But from sort of a basic kind of functional standpoint, it operates similar to something like WordPress. It's sort of a installable web application that you would put on, either kind of a public-facing web host like, DreamHost or kind of an institutional web provider. And you can also run it locally on your computer just for kind of development purposes. So it was decided to move away from kind of building a standalone tool and instead build a Neatline as kind of a plugin that would sort of sit on top of that, kind of content management foundation provided by Omeka. So the Library of Congress supported a sort of joint project where we partnered with the developers of Omeka. So Omeka is developed at the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. So the sort of Library of Congress, supported this sort of collaboration between the two institutions, where CH&M was like working on Omeka, kind of working to improve it, make it more robust, and just kind of make it a better kind of platform for development. And meanwhile, the Scholars Lab would be working on this sort of, geospatial kind of, interactive mapping framework that would sit on top of Omeka and kind of draw from the capacities and resources that Omeka provides. And so, that grant period began in 2009 and ran for 2 years. And we released a first version of Neatline in July of last summer. And so this kind of website is neatline.org. And since then, we've been working on a really pretty large kind of new version of the project, sort of Neatline 2.0 version, that just in the last couple of weeks reached a kind of developer alpha, and we are now in the process of kind of finishing that up and looking towards a public release of the new version in about 1 or 2 weeks. So from here, I want to just go ahead and show kind of some of the projects that sort of the types of projects that Neatline is trying to kind of support, the types of things it can do, and then move into showing some of the new things in the new version of Neatline and talking more broadly about the kind of challenge of sort of telling stories on maps and kind of communicating narratives, and the sort of how sort of where that works, where it doesn't, and what we're trying to do to kind of make that a more robust and and developed area. Okay, so to start out, I just want to show kind of a simple example of, this. So here at the University of Virginia, being where we are in the country, really rich collection of materials from the Civil War in the special. And so one of the most kind of interesting collections is a collection of maps and correspondence by a cartographer in the Civil War that fought with the South named Jedediah Hotchkiss. He was actually born in the North and moved to the South, and then when the war started, he kind of stopped being a civilian cartographer and became a professional military cartographer for the Confederate Army. And there's a fascinating collection of really sort of correspondence ranging sort of the entire course of his life, and a collection of these sort of, really kind of interesting maps that he made. And so Hotchkiss was sort of very well known kind of, in just a sort of as a cartographer, because he was really the first person to systematically map this whole sort of region of the Shenandoah Valley before the war. And is sort of known because he produces these just really kind of aesthetically magnificent maps, just these they're very kind of artistic and extremely detailed, and really very accurate. And they're a really sort of interesting resource to kind of look at the history of the region. So anyway, at UVA, at the Harrison Small Special Collections Library, there's this great collection of correspondence by Hotchkiss and some maps by him. And so in our collaboration with the Library of Congress, the Library of Congress also has the sort of core kind of archival collection of the maps. They have about a couple hundred of maps from the Civil War. And so we were interested in that sort of, in kind of exploring that collaboration. We were working with the Library of Congress, and, both institutions kind of have these sort of parallel collections, of Hotchkiss's work. So we were interested in taking the kind of raw maps and bringing them into Neatline and kind of making, these sort of interactive editions of the maps. And so, kind of by default, the maps can be very dense, kind of complex documents. Sort of before working on this, really knew very little about the Civil War. And so for me, they were very kind of, intimidating to look at. It was hard to kind of make sense of what was going on, kind of what the sort of movement of the battle was in various cases, and kind of what the narrative behind the maps was. And it's also interesting because Hotchkiss himself was kind of involved in a sort of analog version of the same process of kind of reinterpretation and sort of annotation of his own work. And in most of his maps that exist at the Library of Congress and here at UVA, he would go back and kind of entries in the margins. He would sketch in sort of prose notes on the maps. He would take colored pencils and kind of draw on, little bits of detail on the maps and stuff like that. So really what he was doing was, in a sense, similar to what we were interested in doing, in a digital environment. He was basically going back and kind of trying to layer on sort of a new layer of interpretive information on top of the maps. So in this example, this is a pretty kind of focused map of May 2nd, 1863 at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And so what Hotchkiss has done is, so you can see, first of all, that he drew the map kind of off orientation, or sort of off the kind of, conventional way that we draw maps of having, north be sort of vertical up on the page. So the first thing we did was we took the map, and to make it sort of align onto the kind of modern geography backdrop, we took it and geo-rectified the map. So basically that means taking the kind of raw image of the map and sort of assigning kind of, quote, real spatial coordinates to various points on the map, which has the effect of kind of rotating it, scaling it so that, the sort of places on the historical map more or less kind of, correspond to the places on the, sort of geographically accurate kind of base layer that we work with in a digital environment. So that had the effect. In this case, Hotchkiss chose to draw the map, kind of rotated 90 degrees off of north, so that kind of swiveled the map around and put it sort of vertical on the screen. And then sort of the thing we were interested in exploring with this example was, so kind of down at the bottom of, well, originally on the right side of the page, Hotchkiss had drawn in these sort of sort of penciled in these sort of a numbered list of the kind of regiments on the Confederate line that were sort of plotted out on the map. So that it's really kind of hard to see these sort of ghostly little, sort of pencil drawings down here at the bottom. So we wanted to, just kind of take those and, really sort of connect them to the actual location on the map and sort of produce sort of a visual kind of graphical representation of that, data that was sort of encoded in the document, but really not at all sort of obvious or kind of clear if you just sort of come to it in a very quick sense. So what we did was went through and kind of drew, sort of annotated boxes around each of the individual kind of listings down at the bottom, and then drew lines kind of connecting those things to the actual locations on the map. So then you can just, kind of run your cursor across those, the listings down there, and the sort of corresponding location sort of, pops into sort of highlights on the map so you can see what was actually going on there. And so then in neat line 2, if you, in any of these things, if you kind of click somewhere, you get some information about that thing if you've added information about it. So for each of these, entries, we can kind of click and get just sort of basic information about, who kind of historically was being described there. And, you could put much more sort of information in those boxes if you wanted to. So, that's kind of starting out by just sort of establishing, kind of formalizing this sort of, the kind of implicit structure of those annotations as they relate to the map, seeing how they map on to the actual kind of positions, described kind of spatially and, in the sort of actual cartography. And then in neat line 2 is sort of, so you have this sort of aspect of, adding information to maps. Another big aspect of the project is really trying to experiment with ways of communicating kind of narrative progressions about maps. And so this kind of gets at kind of a high level sort of philosophical interest that we've been working on for a while, which is to try to, sort of, often cases in sort of GIS and digital mapping, the sort of use case is very sort of strictly analytical, kind of using GIS to kind of, study and examine and sort of gain insight about very large sets of data that really can't be reasoned about sort of just as raw data. And so, those approaches are incredibly effective. What we're interested in doing is kind of exploring a kind of qualitative complement to that sort of quantitative suite of approaches that's been so successful in conventional GIS. So instead of focusing on kind of gleaning insights from plotting really massive quantities of data, the first version here was really more interested in looking at ways of kind of formalizing narratives and stories and kind of making arguments and sort of staging ideas about the map. So kind of ways of trying to structurally formalize in a digital context the kinds of ideas and thoughts that that humanists have about maps, about sort of the concept of space, generally speaking. So one, we kind of experimented with various ways of communicating those progressions. So in this example, we've laid down these sort of numbered waypoints on the map. So it turns out, and I didn't know this when I started kind of working on this individual project, but so this day, the kind of May 2nd, 1863, is actually a very kind of famous day in military history, because there was this very sort of risky sort of flanking movement that the Confederate Army did around the Union position at Chancellorsville. And so it's interesting. It turns out actually there's this weird kind of sort of overlapping sort of historical causality going on, because so Hotchkiss's job was to go out and kind of explore the kind of areas around the armies and create maps of the region. And so in this case, Hotchkiss actually discovered this sort of little kind of road that provided this sort of flanking route around the Union position, and then told his superiors about it. So he actually, the kind of creation of these maps, in a sense, kind of enabled and kind of caused this actual sort of, military movement, which became a really, very famous sort of moment in military history. So what we did was just kind of started by tracing out that march. So kind of drawing this sort of arrow that sort of traces out the road. You can see at the end kind of, shows where they ended up kind of in the afternoon at the end of that movement. And then kind of laid down these numbered waypoints on the map that are designed to sort of take a kind of, sort of longer format piece of prose that describes this sort of, this environment and sort of what happened here, and kind of actually sort of spatially kind of schematically lay it out on the map, so it really has a kind of direct sort of spatial, keying and sort of significance in the same way that the rest of the environment does. So you can come here and kind of click on number 1 and get, this sort of a first kind of description of, the kind of movement to battle, what had been happening, the sort of, backstory behind this day, and then go and sort of to the next thing, kind of, read about, the sort of actual kind of military maneuver that occurred, sort of, that afternoon. And then the sort of third and final, kind of moment, kind of describing the sort of end game, what happened after the battle. So again, kind of all of these pieces, the sort of marking up the kind of basic, sort of glossing Hotchkiss's annotations, the sort of tracing of the route, laying down these sort of descriptive, the kind of blocks kind of describing different things, and these narrative waypoints. The goal is to sort of play with ways of taking these stories and really kind of giving them a sort of, in a sense, kind of physical instantiation on the screen, sort of in the sort of, canvas of the digital map. Okay, so that's really a pretty kind of straightforward, basic sort of example of Neatline, sort of, basic kind of annotation capabilities. Another aspect of that effort to kind of communicate stories and kind of express these progressions is the sort of temporal aspect of Neatline. So in addition to, taking these maps, which can be historical maps, or they can also be, sort of real geography-based layers. So you can't see it well in this example, but if you back up here, you can see that the map is actually kind of positioned, on a sort of a modern geography, base map, kind of showing where it is in modern terms. And if you, Neatline can also just do, you can build exhibits just on those kind of modern backdrops if you're doing kind of, modern geography or sort of journalistic projects. So in addition to, kind of showing these maps, putting them sort of, in their position, sort of, in kind of a modern sense, we're also interested in exploring the ways that things sort of shift over time and kind of transform at different, sort of temporal intervals. So in this example, and I use this just because it sort of is actually exactly the same kind of location and sort of event in the war that's sort of shown in this map. So if you can see the that kind of flanking movement there is the same as this sort of route right here. So this is another map made by Hotchkiss of the same place. And so this map is from the UVA collection. The previous one was from the Library of Congress collection. And so what Hotchkiss did in this example that we were really interested in was he had basically made a sort of engraving of this map, of this very large map showing the whole region kind of around Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. And he made an engraving of it and then created 3 identical printings of the engraving, one corresponding to each of the 3 days of the Battle of Chancellorsville. And then he went through and literally took colored pencils, and if we come in close here, we can see his work. So these markings right there, so Hotchkiss actually went in and kind of hand drew his own annotations, kind of showing where these things were and what was happening kind of in the moment. So we were interested in this again because, it's very directly in kind of an aesthetic sense, sort of doing what we were interested in doing with these maps, so sort of, adding on this new layer of stuff. And it also had this kind of literal temporal dimension to it. He had sort of, created basically 3 kind of cross-sectional slices showing different, kind of, essentially moments in the progression of, the sort of 3-day battle. So what we did here is we started by doing the same basic process of, kind of, sort of spatially marking up the map and kind of rendering things on the map. So, kind of laying down, again, these sort of lines showing where things were sort of moving, and also sort of using these much more kind of graphical, kind of illustrative approaches, kind of big sort of sweeping arrows moving around the sort of position to really kind of communicate the sort of, the movement of this march and kind of what was going on and, sort of how sort of spatially dramatic the movement was relative to where, the Union Army was actually based. And then again, went through and sort of really in much more depth in this example, kind of laid down these numbered waypoints showing the sort of progression across the course of the day, so the sort of starting out with the introduction, moving towards, this sort of the Confederate Army kind of breaking in half to sort of, fight the 2 halves of the Union Army, and then obviously the sort of, the famous kind of military movement over here. And so then also we experimented in this example, again, sort of on this theme of playing with ways of sort of encoding structure and narrative on these maps with these sort of waypoints over here. So you can kind of click on any of these locations and it kind of takes you to the corresponding location on the map. So you can really just kind of click through and sort of, view the progression as kind of a, sort of a narrative kind of ordered series of waypoints on the map. Okay, so we did that, for the sort of first day, and then also we did it for the other 3 days and made it so that you can just come up here to the timeline and drag the timeline over, and the map kind of switches out, and you get a whole new level, sort of, collection of kind of annotation that's specific just to that map. So let me kind of come in closer here towards the Chancellorsville Crossroads to kind of look at that. So this is sort of the second day of the battle as the action kind of, focused in on Chancellorsville. We can go back to the day before and see that it was, really much more kind of distributed, and, really kind of moving around that location. You just go back and forth and really kind of explore these, temporally keyed maps in a very, kind of interactive back and forth environment that really sort of facilitates that kind of movement. And then obviously, likewise, for the third day, you come over here and see that, in the sort of final day, the action kind of moved over to the east and, finishes up kind of as the Union Army sort of moves back across the Rappahannock there. Okay, so that's kind of playing with the sort of temporal aspects of Neatline. One more quick example before I move into the sort of new stuff we're working on. So kind of, on a spectrum here from the very sort of direct, kind of marking up of a map to this example, which is more interested in, these sort of really kind of graphical displays of sort of how things move. We also were really interested in playing with, really very sort of experimental kind of almost sort of ludic approaches to sort of staging these materials and, kind of exploring their existence as spatial objects. So in this example, this is actually a letter that Hotchkiss wrote that's in the sort of collection of correspondence here at the UVA library. It was actually discovered by the director of our group, Bethany Nowitzki, when she was working on sort of a finding guide back when she was a student here. And it's a fascinating letter because it was written a couple days after the Battle of Fredericksburg, back home to his daughter, Nellie, who lived in his home in Churchville, Virginia, which is about 100 miles kind of to the southwest of Fredericksburg. And it's a fascinating sort of historical document because it begins as a very sort of sweet, kind of description of his campsite, very kind of, really sort of written for his daughter, for a child, a very kind of affectionate, sort of letter. And then in the third page, kind of abruptly switches gears, and he kind of briefly describes this just, unbelievably horrific battle that had just played out. And then at the end, kind of, moves into this sort of fascinating, sort of bizarre kind of, polemic about, about the Civil War and the sort of really fascinating kind of, snapshot into, a sort of Confederate worldview. And so, but the letter is really interesting because it has at the bottom of the third page a sketch of the battle site that actually, sort of, when he wrote the letter, he was doing the kind of professional work of making the sort of maps, the sort of formal maps of the exact same place. And for his daughter, he kind of sketched in colored pencil kind of a very simplistic version of the same map. So there's this kind of literally geospatial aspect to the document. There's actually kind of a map on the letter. We were kind of, sort of curious to sort of explore the idea that that map, in a sense, kind of implicitly sort of geospatializes the rest of the document, kind of sort of draws, sort of casts it onto a spatial grid. So, and likewise, the rest of the document itself, if you look at the actual prose, so you can kind of click here and get the transcription of the document, is really sort of full of, all kinds of textual geospatial references. So, I left home on Sunday, I, went across the Blue Ridge Mountain, went on to Orange Courthouse, and then, so all these kind of references to this sort of movement from kind of leaving his home, coming back to the Army. Down here in the third paragraph, he says, if you look in the large atlas in Virginia, you will find the rivers, the Mat, the Ta, the Po, and the Ni. And sure enough, those are, sort of four rivers, right sort of nearby in Virginia. So what we did was we sort of geo-rectified the actual map on the letter, which again was drawn sort of off orientation. Hotchkiss did this pretty frequently. And so we had to kind of chop it off of the bottom of the third page and kind of rotate it around. And so we made these, really kind of graphic illustrations showing, what we were doing to the document, just to kind of make it clear that we were, really sort of deforming the document, kind of moving it on the map. So we kind of drew this, you can see kind of a graphic kind of showing how the page is breaking off there. And these, sort of this kind of annotation shows, that little sort of bit of text there is that text too. It's just sort of overlapping a bit on the page. So we went and kind of, georectified that, and then took the rest of the pages of the letter and sort of faux georectified them just around the actual map, sort of on the sort of base map. So you have the kind of entire document sort of laid out in its entirety, sort of on a map in a spatial environment. And so then to sort of explore the textual aspects, the spatial aspects of the text, in all cases where Hotchkiss kind of references some place, we drew these kind of lines. So this is for home. I left home on Sunday, so we went back, and you can kind of zoom way back here and see that so way over here is kind of where he left home. This is the town of New Hope. This is the kind of Blue Ridge that he's describing, and Orange Courthouse right there. So kind of connecting those things to where they actually are on the map. Likewise with the Mattapony River, we kind of went and highlighted each of the rivers, so the Mat, down there, the Ta, the Po, and the Ni, and connected his references to the actual kind of places on the map, and then where they kind of coalesce into the Mattapony River down there. And so all those places we've kind of drawn these sort of spindly kind of graphical sort of kind of lines, just sort of identifying those places on the map. And then in the same way, in this example, so we also, kind of annotated the document. You can click and see, what's, the sort of transcription of it. And for the map itself, we were interested in kind of comparing this version of the battle that Hotchkiss had produced, sort of sketched for his daughter, to the actual kind of formal battle maps of the same area. And it's an interesting comparison. So if you kind of come down here and drag the timeline back, you get, sort of overlay on top showing the sort of, official version of the same thing. And it's really interesting to kind of look at what Hotchkiss chose to represent, in this very kind of stripped down minimalistic version of it. He kind of describes some things. He says, the black lines are for Confederate troops, the blue lines are for Union troops, red lines for roads. And there's some places when it's sort of clear that he's, you can sort of identify things on the map that he didn't describe, but is kind of representing implicitly. So up at the kind of northwest of the map, there's this very dark sort of black pencil stroke that, almost surely kind of corresponds to this location in the formal map, which is the sort of a kind of wall that was a defensive position that was a really sort of active area of fighting. Kind of more speculative down at the bottom of the map. There's this, when you kind of look at his sort of, I guess they're kind of maybe ink sort of drawings of the Confederate line down at the bottom. There's this weird sort of break in the line that he shows right there, kind of in this area. So this sort of weird disconnect right there, kind of floating regiment right there. And so we were kind of speculating if perhaps in the actual battle, so that's really close to the one area where the Union line sort of had success in kind of breaking through the Confederate defensive position. So we're just kind of wondering if that could have been, his representation of that, and just sort of, it's interesting to look at this map and really kind of figure out, it's an interesting sort of view into his kind of mental sort of conception of this narrative and what happened sort of, in the battle. And then obviously sort of on the timeline down here, you can see, when Hotchkiss wrote Nellie. So he, the battle ended on the 13th, and he wrote this letter on December 17th. So, 3 or 4 days after the end of the actual event. Okay, so those are some, kind of top-level examples of the types of projects that Neatline is kind of designed to make possible. So now I just wanted to move into showing some of the things we're working on, we've built out for the new 2.0 version of Neatline. That in a lot of ways really kind of represents a pretty major evolution of the project. Really sort of patches up some things that were missing in the first version. It's and really kind of adds a couple features I want to talk about that are sort of, again, kind of trying to build out this capacity of really building these very kind of rich interactive maps. So let me come over to the new version. So behind the scenes, let me just start by kind of talking about the way these maps are created, kind of the sort of content management model behind them. So basically, in all of these examples, so you have kind of a collection of things on the map. And so those things can be different. They can have different sort of instantiations and sort of a cosmetic sense on the map. So for example, each of these vectors, so this the kind of arrow running around the whole map here is sort of a a record in Neatline. So basically everything in Neatline is represented as sort of a record on the map. And the record can have any combination of sort of metadata, and kind of, it can have text metadata, it can have sort of vector geometry, so, these sort of shapes on the map. It can also represent a sort of overlay, a web map service overlay. So, for example, each of these, 4 maps kind of is its own record that's backed by the sort of web map service that's pulling in the kind of geo-rectified tiles and putting them on the map. Each of the sort of waypoints, the kind of numbers on the map, those things are also records. And, of course, all of these sort of lines, those are, just different sort of, they're sort of visually different versions of the kind of regular shape vectors. So basically, the sort of content management model is that all those things are represented as records in the exhibit. So over here, this is a development version of Neatline 2.0, which is really quite stable at this point. We're just in the sort of final stages of getting it ready for kind of an official sort of stable release. And this is just sort of random testing data, just really to kind of serve as sort of a backdrop to kind of experiment with. So over here, you can see we have this list of things. So basically, all of these things kind of represent some object on the map. So in this example, in Neatline 2.0, we've made it possible to add sort of much more content to exhibits. So in this case, we have 100,000 records, kind of objects on a single map. And Neatline will kind of dynamically query things in as you move around. So as I kind of scroll around here, it's just loading in the sort of subset of things that I need to fill the viewport at that point. So, each of these things, I can kind of browse through them over here on the left. I can page through the collection, just sort of clicking, basic kind of forward and backward arrows to move back and forth, so you don't have, all 100,000 records kind of in one massive stack. And so the basic kind of, content management workflow of building these exhibits basically is you sort of add, either import or sort of manually create this collection of records to kind of represent the idea and sort of, whatever the material is, you kind of slice and dice that into records that sort of capture that content. So what I can do is just kind of click on any of these objects, and again, these are just sort of, this is sort of random testing data. Click on one of these, and over here you can see that the kind of list goes away, and instead I get a sort of form that you can use to kind of describe this record, in the context of this exhibit. So I can go, and enter sort of a title, a body. Neatline, the new version of Neatline has a pretty sophisticated kind of rich text editor I can open up here that I can use to, kind of make formatting changes. I can add in images, really any kind of content that you could sort of capture as HTML you can put in there. So you could do, obviously, plain text, images, and also sort of embedded videos, audio. We've had people experimenting with putting embedded views of kind of 3D objects and stuff like that. So really anything at all that you can put in a blog post. Essentially, you can sort of put you can represent in the sort of text for the record. And then over in the map tab, we have the sort of controls to actually add geometry to the map. So the kind of basic GIS things. We can lay down points. I can draw kind of line segments. I have to bump up the line width. Just make that visible. So now we can see that over there. I can, draw polygons, which just sort of close out the shape. So we'll have, kind of a connected, shape like that. And also sort of regular polygons. So I can draw triangles, and I can change that to be, I can make that an octagon, sort of get that kind of shape. So really a pretty flexible sort of set of tools for, adding geometry to the map. And then obviously it's sort of updating that geometry. So I can click and drag around those points, sort of to edit existing stuff. And then also in Neatline, you have a lot of control over the styling kind of appearance of the vectors. So you can control the kind of colors of the shapes, lots of stuff. The sort of color that you get when you click onto the shape. So when you select it, what color appears. The color of the sort of stroke lines that surround the shape. And lots of different sort of attributes to kind of control those sort of visual things, which in the context of Neatline, we found are really actually kind of very core to the sort of process of building the exhibits. because you are sort of always working in the context of sort of a structured color palette that you need to sort of, either the sort of base layer or the overlays you're working with have this very sort of direct aesthetic, kind of layout to them that you need to sort of, work with and kind of conform to. Okay, so a couple of things in the new version that are really kind of designed to sort of support, again, that the kind of sort of storytelling kind of narrative aspect of these projects. So one thing that we found was that, so Neatline kind of implements the basic sort of GIS, geometry drawing tools, the kind of, point, a line, and a polygon. So I can, do those sort of basic options right there. We found, though, in the process of building out the kind of original exhibits and really sort of exploring this type of work is that really, again, kind of the work really sort of takes the form of information design in a lot of ways. So doing things like drawing out the, like this sort of arrow right there, these very kind of detailed sort of structured shapes, or, for example, this kind of jagged, kind of line right there. In a lot of ways, that's really not what GIS tools are designed to do. And there's really kind of a fundamental limitation to what you can do with most of the, sort of established sort of toolkits for drawing that geometry. GIS tends to be designed to, really kind of represent more structured data. So, a point, sort of a blocky kind of rough polygon and stuff like that. So we were kind of frustrated with the difficulty of doing that drawing. It's possible, but it really takes a very long time. In this case, tracing out, the kind of polygon for these roads, that's, it's many sort of individual points that had to be laid by hand. You're kind of getting in the business of sort of manually rounding corners and stuff like that, which is very time consuming and not really very sort of maintainable in the long run, because if you want to change something, you have to go and, kind of edit, lots of points to make a change. So we were frustrated by this because in other contexts, that task of kind of, building complex graphics is really a very well sort of understood problem. So for example, in something like Adobe Illustrator, I can make very sort of sophisticated complex shapes. So, a kind of bracket shape like this, right, that has, I can come in here and kind of, drag out these, individual points and kind of, mutate the shape however I like. And, that can be sort of maintained in a very sort of scalable, sort of nice, kind of standards compliant way. So we, instead of trying to sort of recreate all that functionality in the context of a digital mapping environment, what we did in the new version of Neatline is made it possible to take any kind of vector graphic created in any of these sort of high fidelity, vector editing programs. Illustrator is kind of the most well known, but also sort of open source things like Inkscape, that you can download for free from the internet. So you can build any kind of these, complex shapes and then just save off the file as a SVG document. And so SVG is basically it's a markup language that kind of provides sort of a portable description of the sort of shape itself. So it's kind of a code that represents that shape. So I can save it off and then come here and open up the actual file that Illustrator kind of bakes off from from the program, and you can see it's this very sort of complex, actually an XML document that kind of, it's, basically a version of XML that kind of describes the shape and sort of the various points and kind of the curve information. And I can just take all of that and copy it, and then come into Neatline and in the sort of map sort of tab for any of the records, so kind of below the regular sort of conventional GIS drawing tools, I can click on Enter Markup and paste in that code and click Parse. And then I can just come to the map and click and kind of drag out that shape on the map in sort of a dynamic, interactive way and position it sort of wherever I want, change the orientation of it. So I could do, just put it anywhere on the map, and then that shape essentially becomes sort of first-class geometry in the system. So it's basically the same as if you had gone and just kind of added the points yourself. So if you come in close and we sort of modify the shape, you can see it's, extremely kind of dense mesh. You'd never want to spend, hundreds of hours of your life, sort of doing that by hand. But because it's sort of been transformed into first-class geometry in the system, you can apply all the same sort of styling rules to it. So I can change the color over here. and all of the sort of, it's kind of a normal record in any sort of sense of the word. So what that means is you can really use this to, we hope to sort of explore ways of using this to really create much more kind of aesthetically complex and sort of refined sort of information design on these maps, which in a sense, it's sort of, it's a cosmetic thing, but again, like we've really found that the work of sort of staging these arguments about maps, of sort of telling stories on them, the kind of a big part of the sort of language of doing that is this visual language. So we're hopeful that this kind of thing will really make it easier to make those representations much more kind of high fidelity and sort of refined. So one other thing, let me just start up a piece of software really quick here. Another thing we were interested in doing for the new version was that. So if we go back to some of the other examples, so this example, right? We have this sort of an actual kind of map, that we've built the sort of exhibit around, but we also have these sort of letter pages that even though they have in this case they're kind of here because of the sort of spatial significance of the letters. You could also, there are a lot of sort of use patterns where you would be interested in that same basic sort of toolkit of kind of visually annotating imagery, essentially, and then kind of connecting it to text and sort of putting it in sort of an interactive environment. There are a lot of examples when you might want to do that may not be sort of connected to maps at all. So, for example, if you're in art history, kind of in sort of writing about a painting or something, or a sketch or a photograph. Thinking about ways of taking that sort of non-spatial imagery and applying it and kind of using that as the foundation for these exhibits instead of the spatial, background, which turns out actually to be quite easy because really, the sort of basic technology that is behind these sort of mapping toolkits, really all it's doing is just sort of taking a collection of tiles that have different sort of higher or lower resolution depending on how sort of zoomed in you are, and basically just sort of pulling those in and kind of interactively positioning them on the screen as a user kind of pans and zooms around in the environment. So really, from sort of a technical structural sense, there's no difference really between having those tiles be maps or really any other kind of imagery. So anything you can be sort of captured as an image. So in the new version, we have a feature that makes it possible to do that. So this is kind of an early test. So this is the Neatline editor again, the same environment as before, this time though with basically no content, just kind of an empty exhibit. But what I've done is made the backdrop a photograph. So instead of a map, I have a really high resolution photograph. This is one of the pictures taken during the construction of the Empire State Building. And so I can sort of, zoom in and out in the same way. And this is kind of supported by the exact same kind of tile delivery server that we use to pull in the kind of geo-rectified historical maps. In this case, though, the only difference is that we've just sort of basically assigned kind of fake, or not really fake, but just sort of inherently meaningless sort of spatial coordinates to the picture, so as to kind of trick the geospatial server into kind of pulling in these image tiles instead of the map tiles, but it's the exact same workflow as for a map. So anyway, what you can do with this, once you kind of set this up, is all of the same kind of annotation capabilities. So, I could come in here and create a new record and come over and, draw sort of a shape around something on the photograph. And then, really the sort of workflow is identical. It's just the same process of kind of creating a collection of records that would sort of identify points of interest, describe the material in some way, and really just sort of, add kind of a new layer of information on top of it. So another example, just sort of to kind of show, so this is the Sistine Chapel, kind of a high-resolution photograph, and, we can zoom in really far and get, very kind of high-resolution versions of this. And so the advantage to having this, we actually had a version of this feature in the first release of Neatline that made it possible to just select kind of a static image from the Omeka website, which is, in a lot of ways, it was kind of an experimental feature that in the long run, from sort of a sustainability standpoint, isn't great because, it's not really scalable because as the size of that image grows, basically before the image was getting loaded kind of in its entirety in the browser. So if you make the image sort of larger than a certain amount, it would kind of increasingly hurt the performance of the website. But with this new sort of approach, we've really kind of made it into a more sort of supported feature that makes it possible in these examples to actually pull these images from the kind of powerful, sort of tile serving software that makes it possible to have really kind of indefinitely large images. So, I mean, these really aren't that large. If you come in pretty close, you can start to see the image kind of pixelate, but you could have conceivably, an image that was, 10, 20, 30,000 pixels across, and the software would kind of take care of sort of apportioning it out in sort of small chunks, just depending on kind of where you're focused on the screen. So you could use this to do, annotations and sort of additions of really very high fidelity kind of, professional work in, sort of a kind of a long-term sense. Okay, so that's kind of showing some of the new stuff in the new version. One of the things I wanted to talk about real quick before the end here was one of the things that we have been working on sort of on and off really for about a year now in little kind of bits and pieces, but we're actually about to start focusing on it in a much more sort of structured way, is thinking about, again, the sort of basic question of what the best way to communicate sequences essentially on these maps. In most cases, if I'm sort of doing something with this photograph, I'll sort of, maybe, drop some points down, I'll kind of draw some polygons here and there. But really, usually, especially in sort of the context of the humanities, you're going to have some sort of argument to make about it, sort of a thesis, some kind of structured, just sort of statement about what's going on, if only description or sort of a much more sophisticated, argument about the material. So we've been frustrated in the past. We've experimented with these various ways of doing that. So in the first round of, kind of projects, we, did this approach of having these sort of numbered waypoints that would kind of break up the narrative into different pieces. And in some cases, that's very successful. In others, though, you kind of run into this basic problem of,
David?
In some cases, really,
David,
that argument sort of...
Just a heads up that you have 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm almost done. Thanks. So in a lot of cases, those, so the sort of breaking it up and kind of spatially positioning these things on the map in a lot of cases works well. In some cases, though, you really have a sort of prose document that really kind of has an existence as kind of a first-class entity, as a piece of text that really, sort of anchors the project in some way. If you have, a sort of an article or kind of a chapter of a book, or even just sort of a description that really kind of lends itself to a very sort of conventional sort of vertical, sort of position on the page. And, in a lot of ways, I mean, the sort of, text is the kind of ultimate technology in some ways for communicating those types of narrative progressions. So we were interested in playing with ways of kind of combining the powers of these two things, of really having the sort of text exist, as sort of a first-class thing, but really sort of augmented with these interactive maps or images or photographs or paintings. So we have that kind of interactivity and sort of dynamic aspect of these, sort of neatline exhibits, but also have them sort of keyed very closely onto a text document that would really sort of formalize some sort of narrative progressions. So what we are working on is a sort of extension for neatline that we're calling either neatline additions or neatline narratives, that basically allows you to create a neatline exhibit and then sort of go in and mark up a text document and sort of associate individual words or sentences or paragraphs or whole sections with some, kind of record on the map. So you have this sort of back and forth interaction between a text and the map. So just a really, really sort of early prototype we built to play with this idea is this project called the Mapping the Catalog of Ships, which we built with a professor in the classics department, Dr. Clay here at UVA, and Ben Jasnow and Courtney Evans, two of her graduate students, which is basically showing the catalog. So in Book 2 of the Iliad, Homer kind of lists out this huge list of all the kind of cohorts that sailed to Troy with the Greeks. And they were exploring the kind of spatial positions of these various, the kind of towns that, where these cohorts were from, to see if there was perhaps some kind of sort of device Homer used that would be sort of a geospatial kind of way of remembering the order, like maybe a trade route or some kind of geospatial positioning. So what we can do here is we have, the actual kind of Greek text over here on the left, and we can just sort of come here and kind of highlight the various things. You can see they kind of highlight on the map, and then click on them and actually go to, so a couple of them actually don't have corresponding points over there. But when they do, if you click on them, it'll sort of go to that location and show you sort of where that thing is on the map. And likewise, if you sort of come to the map and come down here and, click on one of these, the text will scroll down to the kind of corresponding location where that thing is tagged in the text. So this, is still just really kind of a proof of concept. We're going to work on this a lot more, though, and sort of think about different ways of defining these interactions. So definitely the kind of direct back and forth of sort of transforming the text and the map in response to one another, and also possibly things like scrolling the text and kind of automatically having the map move as the user sort of moves up or down in the document. So again, just sort of, this is, an effort trying to sort of make it possible to really to combine the technology of prose essentially with the technology of these kind of interactive exhibits. Okay, so that's sort of a quick preview of the stuff we're working on for Neatline 2.0. Again, I just wanted to thank the organizers of this event. It was really a pleasure to be here and speak. Thanks.
There you go. Thank you, David. That was a fabulous first talk. And I actually been posting some Twitter comments and questions that Bethany has been asking. I think we are now, our schedule takes us to the Long Room Hub in Ireland. So thank you very much, David. And
thank you, appreciate it.
On being the first talk. The audio and the images came through very well. And you give
great, thank you so much.
You give a very coherent presentation for 8 in the morning.
Thanks, appreciate it.
I think while the technicians are switching over to Trinity, one thing that Neatline reminds me of, I saw the UCLA's Rome Lab, which is not web-based, but it's again an attempt to build an environment where you can build visual arguments. But in the Rome Lab, it's really just visual arguments about ancient Rome. They have a sort of 3D model. Yeah. But in a similar way, you can sort of build the argument and walk through it and then move your body through space the way you're doing with maps and text.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, I think in the kind of next sort of 2 or 3 years, that moved from, really kind of 2-dimensional views of maps towards like 3-dimensional stuff. So a lot of the kind of open source mapping libraries, like the one that we use called OpenLayers, is actually in some ways kind of moving towards sort of a 3-dimensional globe. Which is really fun because there are a lot of projects that there's a whole new kind of domain of things you could do with 3 dimensions that in 2D you just can't really do. So yeah, I think that transition is going to be sort of a big kind of theme for web mapping projects the next couple of years.
And I assume that you can, in some sense, archive the combination of text, annotations, maps, and images, so that in some ways this can be. It can be archived even if the web application, in some sense, no longer worked.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing I didn't have time to show today, but is really a sort of a large part of the Neatline project, is the integration with the sort of underlying Omeka collection. So Neatline kind of adds on a sort of specific geospatial content management environment that's kind of designed to do the kind of drawing on maps and stuff like that. But behind the scenes, you have the whole kind of Omeka infrastructure for creating double and core records and kind of working with that metadata. And so Neatline's sort of, kind of plugs and plays very directly with that Omeka collection. So you can kind of, if you have objects that really lend themselves to that kind of archival description, you can have those kind of built out in Omeka in a very, sort of straightforward, interactive way, and then you have that really structured, easy sort of portable version of the collection sitting as those metadata records.
So I think we're switching over now. So thanks a lot. All the best.